The three main topics I will cover today: transformations, smart objects, and selections. Mainly where you can find the transform features are under the edit menu. All these from content aware, scale to the auto, align and blend options. It doesn't seem that much, but you can actually do a lot with these. But I also consider cropping transformation and even a couple of other things. And cropping is actually a very advanced thing in Photoshop. You can do so much when you use the crop tool. So crop tool is the tool here on the toolbar. And by the way, don't really look at where tools are in the toolbar anymore and try to learn their position, because toolbars, since the latest update of Adobe products, can be now customized. If you are familiar with these products, it's great because you can get rid of all the unnecessary tools. And you do it by using this little icon here at the bottom, where you put all the unused tools in. So there's the edit toolbar feature. And there you can really drag and drop things that you don't need, and you can even reorganize the tools. So don't really look at my toolbar because I already customized it. I have only the tools that I work with here. But if you remember the shortcut, that's C. C is the shortcut for the crop tool. Now, I'm just warming up. I will be much faster. So if you find that boring, you will probably speed up and you will find it more interesting. One of the shortcuts I use with the crop tool is the command key or control key. You probably notice that this image is on an angle, so it needs some straightening. There's the straighten tool up here, but if you hold down the command key, it gives you the same thing. And all you have to do is to define what's supposed to be horizontal or vertical. So I'm going to draw this line here on the image, and you see immediately it creates the rotation necessary. So if I zoom back, you can already see how that looks. So once again, just do this same thing again, holding down command, draw a line. It doesn't have to all across the image, and that creates the straight version. Now, if I zoom out a bit, I'll show you something else as well. Notice that we have a new feature also on the crop tool called Content Aware. Now, Content Aware has been around quite a long time, but what it can do is it can fill up all the additional space that you get while cropping. And notice we already have some empty parts around the corners. That's because we rotated the image. And if I hold down the Alt key or Option key on Mac, I can increase the canvas in both directions. Because crop tool is not only for reducing the size of an image, but also to extend it. And I want to turn this into a panorama. So not only straighten it, but at the same time turn it into a panorama and let Photoshop do the work. I'm going to press Enter, and that's when the Content Aware engine starts working. Now, it might not be perfect, but it tries its best. Now you see, it managed to do quite a good job here on the right. The voter is a little bit messed up. On the left side, it made some mistakes. I intentionally did it in an example where it's quite complex, and that's sort of on the edge of the limitation of Photoshop being able to do it completely on its own. But that's not the problem, because everything you do in Photoshop you should approach Photoshop that it helps you, but it can't do everything without your input. So this is when our input comes in. So the next thing what I would do here is to retouch this image. But again, for that, we use the tool which also has Content Aware option on it. This is the Spot Healing Brush tool. Now with the Spot Healing Brush, you only have to paint over a detail and hope for the best that it's going to replace it. Once again, it didn't work perfectly, but second time when I draw over it, it starts to fade out more and more. Now I could do this or use another tool called the Healing Brush tool, with which I can actually say, okay, sample from the image here. I'm just using this part here on the water, or I could use the shore, Alt click or Option click on that, and then align it, and then start painting over the parts that I need to remove. Now, for those who have been using Photoshop, probably notice that the difference now is that I get a live feedback of my retouching. So you can see that while I'm drawing, I can see the healing brush. That only works with the healing brush, not with the Spot Healing Brush, but it's still useful. And the same thing I could do here, because it's a clear copy or duplicate, these two buildings of these two. So if I want to go a bit further away from that, maybe use this building here, I can just sample from that, hover over this part here and start painting over, and then wait until it blends into the image. So as you can see, that was quite good change. This one here, again, I can just sample from another area and paint over it quickly, just to blend in something there. Now that's a little bit better, and we can also sort out this part here. Again, I just sample, align, paint over, and immediately it's starting to look quite good. I mean, it's already much wider than it used to be, and as long as it's not important what you have on the image, you just wanted a big, wide view of skyscrapers, then it works fine. So I can also just retouch a bit the sky up there. Now, just to do something additional with this image. So that's what I would call a transformation. We extended the image using the crop tool and content-aware techniques. It's not the typical free transform, because when you use free transform, what happens is everything gets stretched. And there is another feature called content-aware scale, which can be also useful. But what I wanted to do here, just as a last technique, which I will show it here quickly, is if we put some type here. Is there anyone who knows what city is this? I think it might be Chicago, but I'm not 100% sure. Mark, maybe you might know. Not sure. Let's call it Chicago. It doesn't really matter at this point. But let's say we have a big text in the background. That would look quite nice if it can actually go behind the buildings. And that's one thing you should learn if you ever do things in design in general. You have to interact, you have to have your elements interacting with each other. When you just put something on top of something else, it doesn't really look like it's part of it. So no matter how well aligned something is, as long as there's no interactions between the elements, it will look flat. So how do we make interaction? We make a selection, first of all, of the sky. So what I will do here, I use the quick selection tool, and I made a selection of the sky. Now it might not be perfect, don't worry about some mistakes here on the buildings, but it did quite a good job. When I press Q, is the shortcut for quick mask, we can see it in a different view, so it shows us exactly what's selected, and I can see this building is not selected, so I'm just going to quickly add that to my selection. Now it's a little bit better, maybe a little bit more there on that side. All right, so it's like a brush, the quick selection tool. We can just paint over it, and that's it, that's the selection. So now if I select my text, and I click on the mask icon here at the bottom bottom right corner, that's why I call the Japanese flag. If I click on this one here, it creates the mask, and you can see it's only showing the parts that's in the sky. That's exactly what we did, but if I alt-click on the mask, that's what's going to show us white is visible, black is hidden. So that immediately makes it a bit more interesting, and it's slightly more difficult to read, but that's again something. If it's text that's like a whole paragraph that needs to be legible, then this would be a problem because we're actually working against legibility. But here it's a title, it's more of a poster, it's more like an effect, so people will still be able to read the text. But what I would also do is I would make a selection of my text, and this is another shortcut useful to remember. Command or Control click on the thumbnail will make a selection of the text itself. And just before I do that, I will also do something else, just to make it even more interesting. I move the G a bit further to the left and the whole text further to the left. So when I have my selection on the text itself, I will select the mask and I will paint over this little part here with white. And see what that does? That makes it look like the building is in between the G. So the G is wrapping itself around the building. And instead of having it like this, which is still a bit flat, this makes it, that subtle difference, makes it immediately more interesting. And of course, with the brush tool, as long as your mask is selected, you can paint over any detail. Painting with black hides the current layer. Painting with white shows the current layer. So I'm actually just hiding the text to reveal the building in this case. But you see from a distance, that subtle thing is not really something you would spot, but if you know how design works, that's something very important. And of course, we could always apply effects like a gradient and then set it up in a way that is going to make it more interesting. Maybe add multiply, and then we set it up, going from bottom to top. Just reduce the scale a bit. Actually, overlay might be, no? Multiply was good. Yeah, something like that, just reversing it. And, sorry, multiply, where are you? There. And then we have, of course, not radial, we need a linear. So we have a bit of shading at the bottom. So that was just a quick example of how all these things come together. But the next example that I'm going to show you is even easier. But this is something I would like everyone to remember, because I can see throughout the years of training, I know that no one is actually using layers the way they're supposed to be used, or not selecting layers the way they're supposed to be selected. Everyone normally would come here to the layers panel and select an image and then move it around. And notice that wherever my mouse is, doesn't matter, which layer is selected matters. So I can be here with my mouse, but I'm still moving the layer on the left, because that's the one that's selected from the layers panel. So each of these images is a separate layer. Now, you probably know this tool or feature of the Move tool called Auto Select. If that is selected, that's great, because then whatever you click on will be able to move around immediately. And see on the right, it swaps between layers automatically, which is great. I can even click and drag, highlight 2 layers and then move those around. Or again, click and drag, highlight this 3 and move it around. And if I click somewhere outside, that's deselecting layers. So this is great, this auto select feature. But I don't want you to select this, because using it always, having it on all the time, will actually cause more trouble than advantage. So instead I use a shortcut for it and only use it whenever I need it. And the shortcut is Command key, that's simple. So Command or Control, when I hold that down, you see the auto select becomes enabled, but only while I hold down the shortcut. Why is that useful? Because I can have an image selected, work with that, and don't accidentally make changes to the other images. So wherever my mouse, I can still move that layer, but if I hold down the Command key, I can quickly switch between the layers still, just like having auto select on. So with this, I can again hold down Command and click and drag, select multiple layers, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Very simple thing. Believe me, it saves so much time. I actually did a test, and I intentionally changed the shortcut for this, so I can't use it. And I tested the same thing that I did a project. It took me around 10 minutes to do with this shortcut, and I had around like 50 layers in that project. To do it without the shortcut took me half an hour. Just that one shortcut makes 3 times speed difference if you use it all the time. So another thing that a lot of people don't know is when you resize images, you lose quality, no matter what you do. Because we are working with pixel images, you are limited to the amount of detail. So these lavenders look great, but when I zoom closer, they will fall apart, and because the pixels start to show. And that's limited to the resolution of the image, of course. Now, what happens when you resize an image? So I'm just going to resize that image with the lavenders. When I resize it and I make it bigger, it's probably everyone knows this, that we are limited to the remaining amount of pixels. And as you can see, that's really less, because I reduced it to such a small size. When I accept the transformation, it's lost all the detail. So what can we do? That seems like such a basic thing, resizing. The only thing you can do is to maintain the current quality of the image, even when you are resizing. So if I have a duplicate of this image here in the middle, Alt, click and drag with the Move tool will duplicate the current layer. So if I have one of these layers, the one on the right, I am going to right-click on and turn into a smart object. Right-click, convert to smart object, and that little icon appears there. That means now it's turned into a smart object. What that really means is if I make the change in size and then increase the size again, you will see already the difference, that the one on the left lost or completely the details. This one on the right works fine, but hats off to Photoshop. Even with this small amount of pixels that I have here on the left, when I press enter, it will still try its best to interpolate or interpret the details and try to make it better. So you can see it smooths out the pixels, but it's obviously still far from what we have here on the right. So we know that resizing images is a problem, but let's see what happens if we rotate them. It's actually the exact same problem. So if you are not using a smart object and you are starting to rotate an image, even that will mess up the quality. So any transformation you do in Photoshop, if it's not done on a smart object, it's harmful. We call it destructive. So you can see the detail on this image, currently very sharp and nice and detailed. If I use the free transform tool and rotate it slightly, we can't really see any difference right now, but if I continue to do the same thing, and there's a shortcut useful to remember, transform again, Command-Shift-D is the shortcut. I can do this, I call whirlpool effect, and we just rotate, 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 and when we get back to the original size, you can probably already see the degradation in the quality. Can you see how pixelated it got? And if I would continue doing the same thing, let's just go another round, merry-go-around, and then you can see completely messed up my nice image that I had in the beginning. So this is just to prove the point that any transformation you do is lossy in Photoshop, and to make it lossless you need to use smart objects. There's obviously a lot of other additional advantages of smart objects, like the one I'm going to show you in this example. You probably heard of the feature called Puppet Warp. Now again, if you use a smart object before you do this transformation, the Puppet Warp will be non-destructive. So Puppet Warp is up here in the Edit menu. And when I use the Puppet Warp, sorry, I just selected the wrong one, Puppet Warp, there you go, I can set points up on this image. So I'm going to show you that it creates a mesh on that current layer, and on this mesh we can create the pinpoints. So I'm going to put the pinpoint here, there, and on all of these joints, like that. We can also do one on the head if we want, and once we have these in place, we can start moving this around, as you would expect it on a puppet. So it works well with the puppet, and you've probably seen examples of similar things using the Puppet Warp, and that's where normally people leave it, and they say, it's just a gimmick, it's actually not useful for anything. But believe me, I'm using it all the time. First I was a bit skeptical and I thought that it's not really useful, but I found use for it, and I'll show you a few examples. But just to show you, when I turn off the Puppet Warp, you can see that there is a thing created called Smart Filter. Whenever you use a smart object, not only does the layer maintain its quality, but also allows you to use any filter as a non-destructive smart filter, which I can turn on and off, and I can always come back to make changes. So if I select the Puppet Warp, I get my pins back, and I can continue my messing around with this puppet here. So you can see that the smart object, that's an additional advantage, but also for those really who knows everything about Photoshop, you might not know that recently in Creative Cloud, they also made it possible to use adjustments as smart filters. For example, if I press Command U, that's the hue saturation adjustment, and instead of becoming an adjustment layer, it can become a smart filter, which is quite interesting. And once again, you might think like it's not really useful, but believe me, it has its uses, and there's a reason why they implemented this. So it became again a non-destructive filter, which is supposed to be an adjustment. So let me show you another example of the Puppet Warp. Here's a piece of necklace and earrings. I work for companies, jewelry companies, and it's very often that they send me images and they tell me that we took this, or the photographer took this image, but we wanted it slightly in a different angle, or they just want to adjust details on them. And that's when Puppet Warp comes into play. So you use Puppet Warp on the necklace and you decide which points are important. So you put a couple of pins down, and once you have them in place, then you can start moving it around. And it's almost like adjusting the necklace later as if you were the photographer, and just adjust each of these parts individually. And you could go really, really precisely into each of the parts, because you can put as many points as you want on the necklace itself. So you can see that with a bit of adjustment, we managed to change it without actually distorting any details. But that's the same thing with even an orange. If it's not a perfect shape, you can always use the puppet warp on that. The only thing you have to make sure, if it's an image that's in a background layer, is to first separate it from its background. So I normally would select the background or the orange, whichever is easier, and then separate it onto another layer. I'm just going to put it here on another layer. And then once it's on a separate layer, I turn it into a smart object to make sure it's a non-destructive feature. And then we can put down the pinpoints once again. In this case, probably that will be enough. And then we can start moving these parts out. And you can see immediately that how quickly we can adjust it and turn it into a perfectly shaped orange. And that's a typical thing. If you look at products or packaging, you can't believe everything you see is fake. That's just an insider point of view of advertisement. Just to prove the point, here's another puppet warp example. This is actually not the guy's face. That's the original face. So you can change faces as well using the puppet warp. I used a completely different face, but that face had a different bone structure, obviously. But once I apply a puppet warp and move each of these important points of the face in place, then immediately it can work on that different face. Okay, so anything is possible really with simple features like the puppet warp. And then let me switch to this smart objects examples. So I already mentioned working with smart object is important, but here's a few other examples where smart objects are extremely useful. This mock-up of this product would be great to show, for example, an app when you want to advertise an app. And I have this screen saved as a smart object layer, and if I double click on it, it opens up as a separate document. That's how smart object works. Smart object always has a source. So when I double click on the thumbnail, it opens up the source, and notice how the source is actually completely straight. So when we look at this, it's completely straight, which is great because that makes it much easier to put in a screen that I just created. So once I place that layer in, as you can see, I can save this document, and going back to the mockup, it's already there. And the good thing is I already have a reflection on top of it, so it makes it look very realistic. But the good thing about this is I don't have to do the transformation every time, and I don't have to align it to the screen. If I just go into the source, edit in there, and that's it. So let me show you another example. Here we have two screens, and each of these uses the same image. You see here on the layers, we have two smart objects, right screen, left screen. Now, if I double click on the right screen, we go into the actual source, and then I can replace this with something. Let's say this image here. I just drag and drop that in, resize it to make sure it's the right size, save it, go back, and what will happen is updating both of those layers. Now, the reason why that happens is because smart objects are slightly tricky. When you duplicate a smart object, their source is still going to be the same. So they are sharing the same source file. And that file you can't find on the computer by default is something embedded into this Photoshop document. So the way you can separate these two to make sure that they are not linked to each other is you right click on one of them, maybe this one here on the right, I right click, and that's when you use this option called New Smart Object via Copy. When you do that, the new one that's going to be created, that copy layer there, is not connected to the previous one anymore. So what I can do now is if I double click on this and I switch back to the other layer, by the way, within smart objects you can have layer structure. So you can have as many layers within a smart object as you want, and that's why I managed to just switch back to the previous example. Once I save this and go back, you can see that here now we have two different images. So you have to separate your smart objects if you don't want them to be linked. So that's another important lesson learned there. And here's another example. One of the classrooms of academy class, we have the trainer's machine and the student's machine, but they are all linked to each other. So in the previous example, it was actually a disadvantage to have them linked, but it can be a huge advantage if you know how to use it correctly, because now if I want, I can command click on one of these students' machines, I double click on the smart object, that's going to show me the composition, and maybe we just change it to the designer's Fiesta logo. I save this, go back, and you see it automatically updates everywhere. because they are all the same source. Okay, so you can actually use that to your advantage if you ever need that. And even the same thing here with the trainer's machine, I would be able to do the same thing. So that's just another advantage. And here I would like to also point out another important fact. That's again a feature introduced in Creative Cloud, the search for layers. There's a search option or filtering option for layers. Notice how many layers I have here. Obviously, for each screen, I had to create a separate layer and transform them accordingly. So each of them are named. I used iMac for the students' machines, and I think I called shared screen for the trainer screen. So if I want to quickly organize this big mess that I have here on the right, I could use the search option. Here in the layers panel on the top, you have an option called name. And just like searching on your computer, you could type in this case, iMac, and then it automatically switches into filtering mode and only shows the layers called, or which has the name in it, iMac. That way I can quickly group these together, and then I change my search result to shared. I quickly group these together as well. And when I turn off the filtering, so if I now turn off filtering here and I go back, you see how much tidier everything? Because I created a group for each of these separate layers. So when you know what you are looking for, you can do that. And the good thing is you can also search for not only kind when you are looking amongst layers, but you can also change it to, for example, you are looking for only smart objects and so on and so forth. But let me show you another example for smart objects, and this is again taking it to the next level. So if you thought that that's all that you can do with smart objects, it's not everything. You can also create linked smart objects, and I'm quite proud of this feature. I'm probably the first one who asked for it like 6 years ago on Adobe's developer site, and they actually implemented it 3 years ago, which is not bad. And this feature, what it does is that it can use an external file and use that as the source of smart objects within multiple Photoshop files. So the example I have here is quite simple. I'm just going to close all of these documents so we have a fresh start. I open these two Photoshop files, and I have in both of them this linked file, and you can see actually can't find where is this, so I can always look for it on the computer, but I'm just going to actually find it like this. So training, no, we are in here, Photoshop, smart objects, and there's the logo. So I just wanted to show you this is the Illustrator file. It's a logo that was created in Illustrator, and it's actually linked to that. So when okay. Once it's updated, you can see the difference between the two. This is an embedded smart object. This is a linked smart object. And in the other document, when I go into this document here, you can also see that we have the same logo, and everywhere where that logo is, it's supposed to be linked. So once again here, whenever you have a missing link, all you have to do is update, relink. Don't know why I forgot. I probably renamed the file. Yeah, that was the problem. So if you are familiar with InDesign, it's quite similar to that. So instead of using an embedded link, it's going to link to that external file. And what that does is if I change that file, so I come to Illustrator and I recolor this logo. So I decide to use, maybe because it's a shark, it might look better with blue colors, obviously. If I save that, and then I go back to Photoshop, it's going to update everywhere in every document where it was used. And see, that's the advantage between a linked smart object and a dumb smart object, which is not linked to the original file. So that couldn't update, obviously. But what you can do is always right-click, and you can just say that you want to relink to a file, and then once you do that, it will also be linked from that point on. So linking smart objects is also useful. I don't want to spend too much time. It might be a little bit too confusing. But let me show you another great example of smart objects. So here's a plan, a visual plan of an interior design of reworking a kitchen. So that's the original, and that's the reworked version in Photoshop. And you might wonder, what would you do here with smart objects? Well, to be honest, I do everything with smart objects. So when I show to a client a plan like this, I can always show them different variations. So if they tell me that, oh, we actually imagined something else in the background, and also the floor, we imagined it differently. Instead of you going in and making transformations, what you do is you command click with the move tool on the layer, in this case the floor, and then you say, oh, of course, yeah, we have other options as well, and then you just switch to another one, save that, go back, and immediately you can show a different version, and it remembers the transformation, the perspective, and everything. If they still don't like it, they say, oh, we actually want marbles. No problem, I have tiles as well, so I can show you that, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine the same thing I can do with the wall as well. I have multiple different versions, textures of the wall, and so on and so forth. So that's a huge thing working with smart objects, and I could show you several other examples. Hopefully now you really see the potential in working with smart objects. But another big topic is selections, and there are obviously so many different ways of making selections. Again, recently Photoshop improved its selection and masking techniques. But before I actually show you a selection, I can show you how to avoid spending time making selections, because in Photoshop there are these things called adjustment layers. You can find them from here at the bottom on that little icon. You come up and you choose an adjustment, and maybe, for example, you want to use something like hue saturation, which is a very standard basic one. With this one you can mess around the colors, you can reduce saturation, increase saturation, you can change the hues in an image, and so on and so forth. Now this is great, but not many people know that most of these adjustment layers have this targeted tool, or on image editing tool they call it, the little hand. If you click on that, you can click on a detail in the image and drag left to reduce the intensity of that color, drag right to increase the intensity. But what I wanted to do here is this very typical, quite cheesy technique to pop a detail. I'm sure you've seen this in like London, the buses, red, it's always everywhere on these tourist photos or posters that they sell. But you see how quick that was. I didn't have to do any selections. I filtered out all the green colors from the image, and I could even click on the road a bit and drag it to the left to also remove a bit of that yellow, and then I click and drag on the red to really emphasize that. Actually, it will bring up both of the colors at the same time, but I'm sure you get the point. This is never going to be as precise though as doing it with a selection, but it still gives you a very fast result. Okay, and by the way, whenever you use the on image editing, if you hold down the Alt key, instead of changing, hold down the Command key or Control key on PC, instead of changing the intensity of the colors, you will be able to change the actual color itself. So the hue is going to be amended. So let me show you the other example I have here. One of the easiest selections, I would say, is the focus area in case you have a complex background, but the background is out of focus. This is also a quite new feature, but I started using it straight away and I use it so many times. So as you can see here, we have hair, we have quite a complex background. It's not an easy selection. The only thing that can help us is that there is focus difference between the background and the boy in the foreground. So what I would do in this case to select the guy is to go into the select menu and choose the focus area option. Once you select that, Photoshop will try to go ahead and automatically select whatever it finds in focus. And it did a pretty good job, considering that it only left the road in still visible, which is actually also in focus because it's close to us. So if you ever need to remove something, just hold down the Alt or Option key and paint over the parts that you don't need. That's how quickly it was removed. And if you find any details that's actually missing, just paint over it normally and then it will be added. Okay, and that's how quick that was. And then I would be able to refine it further, but I just wanted to point out how quick and easy this was. And once you have a selection, of course, you can always turn it into a mask. And remember, the mask is the little Japanese flag at the bottom, and Alt click on the mask can show you how the selection was created. So it's quite good, but of course the hair might need some improvement. But for the hair I have a better example, so I will come back to that. So of course you can't always rely on the focus. So what else can we use? Well, let me show you another tricky selection here. When we have an object that's quite well defined, so it's a very like sharp, we call it hard edge detail. By the way, hard edge and soft edge details, on the previous example, I would say hard edge detail all around the body, and then soft edge is the hair. So you have to approach hard edge and soft edge selections completely differently. And I know that for a fact that people avoid using paths whenever they make selections. Some of you might be confident with working with paths, but most of the people avoid using paths because it's a little bit tricky to work with, or pen tool. But these are better for hard edge selection. So let me prove that point for you. When you use paths, you basically talk about vector shapes. So if I, for example, select the ellipse tool and I set it to path mode here on the top. So the ellipse vector shape tool set to path mode. With that, I can draw a shape around this part here to make the selection. Now you might be wondering, why don't I use Magic Wand or a quick selection tool? The reason for that, because they will never create a perfect selection around shapes. They will always be pixelated and the edges will look jagged. So when you have a nice geometric shape, you should use geometric tools like these shape tools. Now you see I created this path, but I can always use free transform and adjust it until it gets into the shape that I need. Now I'm not going to work very precisely here because it's more important the technique itself, how it works. But once you have a path in place, you can turn that into a vector mask by holding down the Command or Control key and click on the mask icon. So that creates a vector mask, which is a slightly different animal. It's not a pixel mask. It has that path still available to make changes to. And of course now we can move that around and reveal different parts. But what I wanted to do is to double click on this path, okay, and reduce the density, meaning I can reveal in the background the actual object. So it's almost like tracing and showing those parts that we need to work with. So if I continue adding shapes in here, using the rectangle tool for example, I can add another piece in here, and once it falls in place, you have to also make sure you set it up in the right mode. You just want to combine these two shapes, so from the path operations you choose combine shapes, and immediately we get a good shape here which we can work with. And using things like the direct selection tool, you can select individual corner points and move them around and adjust them exactly in the way you need it. So when I set them up, you can see that it starts to get closer and closer to what we need. Now, as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can imagine using this technique, it might seem like a time-consuming thing to do, and obviously not as fast as the Magic Wand or Quick Selection tool, but this will give you a perfect shape around the edges. And of course, you can always use the pen tool as well for the same reason. And once you are ready, you just increase the density, and then you can put a different background in there. I'm just going to fill it with black or something like that. But notice the difference between this selection, and I just intentionally show you what the quick selection tool would do. So you see how nice and sharp the edges look here. And then if I delete this, okay, and I try to make a selection of this using the quick selection tool or Magic Wand, I just paint over this and go all the way to the edges as well. When I use normal mask on that, okay, and I zoom closer, that's what you get with quick selection tool. Can you see the difference? So it's never going to look as sharp as the one that we created with the vector mask. It's always going to be very obvious that it was selected, while this one looks amazing. I mean, you can always refine these parts nicely as well. All the little details can be selected perfectly. Now, you are probably more interested in people, so let's just switch back from objects to people. And here's another example of hair. Very complex selection, you might say, but it can be selected and you can really nicely isolate it from the background. So this is something that people like to find out how to do. And I've seen people doing the same thing on complex hair selections on white background, which is still tricky, But to be honest, that's much easier than to do it on a very strong color like green or blue, plus having something else going on in the background. You might be thinking that actually there's out of focus details in the background. Maybe we can try the focus area on this one as well. It's not a bad idea. You can always try something that doesn't take long to test. So we can go on to select focus area and see what it comes up with. So it will give us a suggestion of what it thinks is in focus currently. And it's not that bad. I mean, it did quite a good job. We could always paint over the missing parts, so we don't want to lose her neck. And see how quickly I got to a fairly good selection. So I don't even use quick selection in these cases. I get to quite a good selection this way. But then I turn this into a mask and I just put something in the background just so we can see how it looks at the moment. So the hair, the soft edge part, is still really bad. That needs some attention. So this is when I double click on the mask. And this is where you can decide what you want to do. Photoshop will ask you if you have the latest version of Creative Cloud, you will get this new option called Select and Mask. If you click on that, it takes you into this new workspace called Select and Mask, where you have all the options to make changes to your selection. And look at this. I mean, I think is an amazing feature. Here you have this tool called Refine Edge, or Refine Edge brush tool. And the shortcut to change your brush size is Control Alt, click and drag left and right. That's the same all around Photoshop. Control Alt on Mac and PC as well, but on PC you have to right click and drag to do the same thing. So that's for changing the size. And what you want to do is to paint over around the edges of the hair. Now, by default, it seems like it completely messes up the edges, but what you can do is to turn on this feature called Smart Radius and also play around with the edge detection. Now you might still find that it's not going to work well in this example, and that is because I didn't have enough selected of the hair. I actually find it's easier to have a bit more selected of the hair, and you can do that by just simply using this other tool. This is called the brush tool. If with the brush tool you paint over the hair, and you might think like, okay, we completely lost everything that we had here, it's actually going to help us, it benefits us. So we have a little bit more selection here of the hair, and that is when I switch to the Refine Edge option. And with that, look what I'm doing. I'm keeping my brush away from the hair and go around it. So that's what I'm trying to do. And here, of course, it's a little bit too big, my brush, just I'm trying to speed up things. That's why it's getting a little bit too big on that side. But when I paint over it with a smaller brush, you can see how it starts to build up quite nicely. Let's do it on this side here. I paint around the edges, and it actually did a quite good job there. But you might be still thinking like, all that mess around the edges, how am I going to tidy that up? Well, for that there is a great technique as well. So at this point I would normally just say okay, and I'm happy with that. But that's when I do the last step. Alt click on the mask icon, and that's when you really see what you managed to create. Is this a good selection? Yes, because it can be saved. It has quite a good detail around the edges. All you need to do, so once again, that's Alt clicking on the mask, which shows you the actual mask colors, the black and white. And that's when you switch to the tools like the Dodge tool and the Burn tool. These two tools are great when it comes to refining your masks. What you want to do is to use the Burn tool and set it to range shadows, and start painting over any details that you don't wish to see. And look what happens when I paint over here. It's almost like magically filtering out things we don't need and keeps the hair visible. Then I switch to the Dodge tool, keep it on highlights, this one. So the Burn was on shadows, this one is on highlights. And with this one, I paint over the details of hair, and I want to brighten them up more, so then when I switch back to normal view, see how much better it looks already. And I can even do it, I don't even have to be in the mask view. Okay? You don't even have to be in the mask view, you can even work here. So what I would do, first of all, Burn, and filter out the unnecessary noise from the background. See how nicely it tidies up everything without losing the hair. You can see how nicely it works. Can do it here as well. See, every hair strand stays that I need. And then Switching back to the dodge tool, I can paint over the hair, and making sure, this is important, that you don't leave any semi-see-through hair in the middle. So you want these to be completely white, meaning they are visible, and you just paint over them a little bit more and define them nicely. Now, last thing that you might need is, obviously I could do the same thing here as well, but what's important is you don't want to leave any green color still visible there. So that's when you create an empty new layer and you create a clipping mask. You alt-click between the two layers, hold down Alt or Option key, click between the two layers, and that turns this layer into a clipped layer. What that means is whatever I paint on this, I'm just going to show you with white, it will only show over the visible areas on the layer below. So it doesn't go beyond it. But what I want is to pick a color from the hair. So I alt-click somewhere on the blonde hair here, like that. And then we can start painting with that. So once we have a selection of the hair, we can start painting over this. But again, what you want to do is make sure that your brush is set to a lower opacity, and also like 10 or 20, and also it's set to no hardness, to 0 hardness. So it's a very soft brush. And when I zoom closer, you can see what I'm going to do. I start painting over, and I'm just applying the color very carefully. So I'm not going to paint it completely to that color. I'm just replacing those colors. And look, without and with. So it's a very subtle amount. And if you want to make sure that the colors don't turn to something odd, you can also change the blend mode of this layer to color. There's a blend mode called color. So I'll show this again. From the drop down where it says normal, you just change to color. And that makes it even better. So when I zoom closer and I turn it on and off, you see how subtle that colorization is. And if I go to this side here, let's just test it out. I use my brush. Thanks to the clipping, it doesn't go anywhere, just on the hair. And see how nicely I can paint over that. Now I'm cheating here because I could remove that in the mask. But as soon as I paint over it, it actually becomes like it's part of the hair. So I don't even have to mask it out. It looks fine. So you can see that with all these techniques combined, you can tackle the most complex selections as well. And then really it's all about combination of them and how you apply them onto images. So most important thing usually when you look at an image, which selection technique is best is another good example of selecting hair. You can see once again the same method I've done would be perfect here, just to show you even faster than one I did in the other one. You might think like it was too complex. You can actually do it even faster using the quick selection tool. You make a selection on the person you want to select. I'm just going to select these details as well. I'll just have the thumb, and then I don't know why it's so slow. Let me try it again. Yep. So we have that. And again, I would say hard edge and soft edge details. And here, again, it's quite tricky because we have the hand out of focus, the face is in focus, and the background is out of focus again. So I wouldn't start with focus area here. Instead, I go straight into, look at this, from quick selection tool into select and mask. And immediately it gives me a preview, but you can decide what background you wish to see it on. Let's just use black. And that is when you still see all that blue details in the background. You can see on the edges, the blue detail and the hair is really bad. But that's when you use the same tool, this brush. You just simply paint over around the edges. So what I do, paint over around the edges and see how amazingly it filters out and just shows those details of the hair that we need. Even here at the bottom, we can reveal all those parts. And then if you want to save time and don't worry about using the brush, you could even use this feature called Decontaminate Colors. And that actually does quite a good job. If I turn it on and off, you see it on his hair. There's no blue details visible anymore. So it managed to filter that out. And we can say, let's accept this. And thank you very much.